All right, everyone. I'm Ms. Ballinger, and I will likely be your teacher next year if you take IB World Lit higher level. And so I wanted to talk through your summer reading assignment with you. Normally I would come talk to you in class. However, that is not to be this year. So we're going to try it this way. Summer reading this year is going to take a little bit of a different format than in years previously. There we go. No, go back. There we go. Go back. One more time. All right. So there are 4 goals for summer reading. The first is to identify your current reading perspective, and I'll explain what that is. Build aesthetic thinking habits, which I'll also explain. Break passive reading patterns, and begin your IB learners portfolio. And each of those is likely some new vocabulary that hopefully you'll understand by the end of this presentation. Okay, so an aesthetic thinking habit incorporates all of these reading perspectives, which means that you can switch back and forth between them depending on the type of text and what you're interested in with it and kind of the demands of what I'm asking you to do with it. You probably already adopt one of them naturally. You probably already, if you're a reader, which means you actually read the books that you're assigned, you probably automatically go to one of these when you're reading just as you, without even thinking about it. Okay, so an associative reader relates the reading to their own experiences. An investigative reader will make guesses about what's going to happen next and will test those against what actually happens. A speculative reader likes to apply reading to life and see, like, what does this say about the big picture or the deep questions that every human faces. An affective reader really responds to the emotional demands of a text and what's happening emotionally. Not just, oh, this makes me feel this, but really looks at how the text positions the reader to feel a variety of ways. And then a cognitive reader really enjoys trying to figure out what's happening in the reading and enjoys that sense of challenge and that kind of feeling of that the reading is a puzzle. Now, quite often, reading instruction really focuses on developing the associative and the affective thinking habits. The problem with that is they don't go far enough. Relating a text to your own experiences is a really good place to start. However, it's not by itself. It doesn't go high enough in terms of the level of thinking for an IB diploma level response. The affective response and noticing how a book makes you feel is something that's really important to write about in your learner's portfolio. And it's, again, a first step, because one of the things we look at in IB is not what it makes you feel, but how the author uses specific techniques to cause that emotional reaction. And so that's a different, it's the same thing, but from a different perspective. Now, if associative or affective is not your natural reading style, you probably felt a little bit pushed out of your early reading instruction. Some of you might have persevered and just kind of read for yourselves in your own way, but some of you might have felt so pushed out of reading because you didn't really want to talk about the feelings in it or relate it to your own experiences, that you actually became what we call a passive reader. Passive readers generally don't remember much of what they read. They get very tired of reading quickly, and they avoid reading whenever they can, and sometimes even when they really shouldn't. And a passive reader is someone who doesn't really engage with the text and kind of stands back away from it. If you are a passive reader, guess what? You are not broken. You just need to build some active reading stamina and habits. So you're probably like, but yeah, that's great. What exactly is our assignment? Well, that's really going to depend on where you're entering from, right? So if you're a reader who reads, which means you've read novel length books, maybe you don't always love everything you're assigned to read in class, but you read on your own, you have a favorite book, or you have books that you've read that you like better than other ones. Basically, you read a book rather than fake it and find ways to not read a book. Okay, so if you actually read, you're going to reread something that's novel length that you enjoyed. And you're going to divide that book into 8 sections, right? So, you know, novel length, we're thinking at least 200 pages. However long it is, you're dividing it into 8 sections. Maybe they're equal sections, but maybe the book itself kind of divides into different sections, and you want to make sure that you break there and then divide somewhere else. So I'm leaving that up to you. It doesn't have to be equal, but I want you to have 8 good stop points where you stop and do some thinking. At the end of each section that you've selected, you're going to select a prompt from your usual perspective and one from a different perspective. And if you're not sure what your usual perspective is, it should become really apparent as you start rereading this book that you enjoyed. That kind of natural reading perspective should kick in pretty quickly. And you're going to respond to both prompts in your learner's portfolio, which we'll talk more about here at the end. And then you're going to go through the exact same process with an unread book. So if you're a reader, your summer reading assignment is to read 2 books. One book that you have already read, you're rereading it. And that is a different experience than reading it the first time. So hopefully you're not inclined to fake it, but you can't fake it. It's a different experience when you reread something than when you read it the first time. Now, if you're a passive reader who usually fakes it, the last thing I want to do is give you another opportunity to fake read. Your goal is going to be to build stamina over time, because again, your brain's not broken, but you do need to build up some novel length stamina. That's probably the biggest thing you're missing right now. You want to choose something that you're interested in. I don't care what it is. It could be a magazine, it could be a book, it could be something online, but choose something that has some paragraph density. Don't just scroll through a feed. Because again, you're wanting to build your eye stamina and your brain stamina. And each week you want to set 2 to 3 15-minute reading sessions. And in those reading sessions, if you get sleepy or you lose track of what you're reading, you're going to pause and practice one of these 3 strategies. You're either going to ask one of the questions in the prompts, so from one of those reading perspectives, and they'll be on the next slide. You're going to annotate, which is harder to do online, but is possible. It's easier to do on paper, obviously. Or you're going to visualize. And we'll actually go through all of those with the sample reading here in just a moment. One of the challenges that passive readers often have is, unfortunately, people told you to stop using your imagination too soon. Most people were probably teachers. And you just need a little bit more practice with visualizing. That's a really important thinking strategy and imagining strategy if you're going to move from being a passive reader to an active reader. And then you'll reflect on each week's progress in your learner's portfolio. The prompts, I just basically turned descriptors into questions, right? How did you relate the reading to your experience? What hypotheses did you make? What did the reading say about life? What were the emotional demands? What were some enjoyable challenges? Okay. And again, we're going to model all of those with a brief reading on the next page. And then for becoming a more active reader, your reflection would be, you would put the date, the title, the author and or platform, because not everything has an author if you're reading online, but you should say kind of where you found it. The time started, the time ended, and then any active reading strategies you use to stay focused, okay? And so now we're gonna have a brief demonstration. Oh. And to do that, I actually need to go to a different place. We are going to go to my drive and where did I put that? No. Where did I put it? Over there. I thought I had this as part of the presentation. Apparently I did not. Okay, but here we are yet again. We are actually going to read this entire collection from Sherman Alexie next year. But we're just going to start with just a tiny bit of one of the stories from that collection called Because My Father Always Said He Was the Only Indian Who Saw Jimi Hendrix Play the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. And we're just going to read a little bit so I can model each of those reading perspectives and active reading strategies. So during the 60s, my father was the perfect hippie. Since all the hippies were trying to be Indians, because of that, how could anyone recognize that my father was trying to make a social statement? If you're thinking philosophically, right there, we already have something to chew on. But there is evidence, a photograph of my father demonstrating in Spokane, Washington during the Vietnam War. The photograph made it onto the wire service and was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country. In fact, it was on the cover of Time. In the photograph, my father is dressed in bell-bottoms and a flowered shirt, his hair in braids, with red peace symbols splashed across his face like war paint. In his hands, my father holds a rifle above his head, captured in that moment just before he proceeded to beat the shit out of the National Guard private lying prone on the ground. A fellow demonstrator holds a sign that is just barely visible over my father's left shoulder. It read, "Make love, not war." So in terms of how to visualize, if you slow down when you get to this photograph of Victor, we'll get his name later, Victor's father, and you make the effort to picture the bell bottoms, the flowered shirt, the hair in braids, the red peace symbols splashed on his face like war paint. Okay, the rifle above his head, and that moment just before something happens, right? And if you take the time to really picture that in your mind like it's a movie, you'll get a lot more out of it because we have some interesting contrasts, right? He's got peace symbols that look like war paint. He's dressed like a hippie, but he's getting ready to hit somebody. The sign above his shoulder says, "Make love, not war." And so in that paragraph, we have juxtaposed, that's a word we'll use a lot, so go look it up if you don't know it, a bunch of contradictory imagery. And we would want to already be kind of thinking of that. If you're a cognitive reader, starting to think of that puzzle and what it might be telling us about what's going to happen. The photographer won a Pulitzer Prize, and editors across the country had a lot of fun creating captions and headlines. I've read many of them collected in my father's scrapbook, and my favorite was run in the Seattle Times. The caption under the photograph read, "Demonstrator goes to war for peace." The editors capitalized on my father's Native American identity with other headlines like "One Warrior Against War" and "Peaceful Gathering Turns into Native Uprising." And once again, we see those contrasting oppositions continuing in that next paragraph. Anyway, my father was arrested, charged with attempted murder, which was reduced to assault with a deadly weapon. It was a high-profile case, so my father was used as an example. Convicted and sentenced quickly, he spent 2 years in Walla Walla State Penitentiary. Although his prison sentence effectively kept him out of the war, my father went through a different kind of war behind bars. There were Indian gangs. I'm back. There were Indian gangs and white gangs and black gangs and Mexican gangs, he told me once. And there was somebody new killed every day. We'd hear about somebody getting it in the shower or wherever, and the word would go down the line. Just one word, just the color of his skin. Red, white, black, or brown. Then we'd chalk it up on the mental scoreboard and wait for the next broadcast. My father made it through all that, never got into any serious trouble, somehow avoided rape, and got out of prison just in time to hitchhike to Woodstock to watch Jimi Hendrix play the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, this is where we can start bringing in some of our associations, right? We've all heard the Star-Spangled Banner one way or the other. If you've heard the way Jimi Hendrix plays the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, that is an entirely different version of the song. It's an entirely different emotional experience. If you haven't listened to it, you might consider just pressing pause and going and listening to it on YouTube now and then coming back, because it will give you a better frame of reference for what's gonna happen next. But the emotional demands of that song, which is a very intense, proud, and in places angry, but in other places tender version of the Star-Spangled Banner, is very different than the usual kind of 4th of July happy picnic sound of the Star-Spangled Banner version that you hear at the beginning of the sports events. And so that is, again, a contrasting opposition that is asking the reader to think about why Jimi Hendrix would play the Star-Spangled Banner that way, and why Victor's father might feel so attached to that, and why he says what he says next. After all the shit I'd been through, my father said, I figured Jimmy must have known I was there in the crowd to play something like that. It was exactly how I felt. You know, and if we're thinking about kind of that philosophical stance, how important it is to us as human beings to feel recognized and seen, especially after we've been through something that's really traumatic, and to feel like we're not alone because somebody out there understands us. 20 years later, my father played his Jimi Hendrix tape until it wore down. This brings up a little bit an associative thing for me because I'm an 80s baby. No, I was actually a 70s baby, but I was a young adult in the 80s. And we young adults from the 80s, or we who were young adults in the 80s, we really loved our cassette tapes. Like people who are much older than us, they're all about their albums. Hipsters who are much younger than us, they're all about their albums. But man, we loved our cassette tapes, even though they were fragile and they would stretch and then they would come unspooled and you would have to fast forward to get to that song you really wanted to hear. There was something about the difficulty of them that we really liked. Over and over, the house filled with the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air. He'd sit by the stereo with a cooler of beer beside him and cry, laugh, call me over and hold me tight in his arms, his bad breath and body odor covering me like a blanket. You know, this is another more complex type of association. When we're in younger grades and we're asked to make a connection, we're asked to make these very simplistic connections like, oh, I have a dad too, or, oh, I haven't seen my dad in a really long time. This is asking us to remember what it's like to be a child and to have everything that adults do just be normal. Where whether the experience is pleasant or unpleasant, right? The hug is very pleasant. Bad breath and body odor is maybe less pleasant, but it covers him like a blanket, so it makes him feel safe and secure. You know, to little kids, adults are like a foreign language, and we just accept that they're there. And so Alexi is positioning us back in that wide-eyed childhood, complete faith in the adult, even if the adult isn't perfect. And he's about to give us what he's going to call a ceremony, and we're going to stop reading after the ceremony. And the word choice ceremony there is very intentional, right? It's not just the thing they did every night. It's not just a habit, it's a ceremony, something that makes it sacred, and also maybe something that is intended to be healing. Jimi Hendrix and my father became drinking buddies. Jimi Hendrix waited for my father to come home after a long night of drinking. Here's how the ceremony worked. I would lie awake all night and listen for the sounds of my father's pickup. 2. When I heard my father's pickup, I would run upstairs and throw Jimmy's tape into the stereo. 3. I would bend his guitar into the first note of the Star-Spangled Banner, just as my father walked inside. 4. My father would weep, attempt to hum along with Jimmy, and then pass out with his head on the kitchen table. 5. I would fall asleep under the table with my head near my father's feet. 6. We dreamed together until the sun came up. So notice how just having that text structure of that list makes that list more important. Notice all of the sound imagery. We have listening for the sounds of the pickup. We have the stereo, we have the bend of the guitar, we have the weeping father, and it's all about the sound because Victor isn't seeing his father in this memory, he's listening to his father because Victor's underneath the table. And then we have that complementary opposition, Victor's head near his father's feet, and they're dreaming together until the sun rises, to create that sense of unity. And we're gonna stop there. I think we've gone through all of the reading perspectives. The cognitive piece, I'll go back to present. This cognitive piece, the enjoyable challenges, he does go back and forth with the past. Like he starts us off in the past and then moves us forward. We have that list, but really the cognitive challenge there is being presented with that juxtaposition of things that should be opposite in most stories, but here they're really kind of working together and becoming two halves of a whole. And so that would be one of the enjoyable challenges for me in looking at that reading. The emotional demands we talked about. What did the reading say about life? We talked about hypotheses. Did we make and test about the reading? If you wanted to make some hypotheses from here. I've read this story a million times before, so it's not really fair for me to do. But if you take what we've read so far and then try to imagine given this opening, what do you think is going to happen in the rest of the story? That might be kind of that investigative perspective. And then we talked about the associative piece. And then these questions, right? Are good ways to kind of come back and stay active while you're reading if you're a passive reader. Annotations, your annotations shouldn't even be something that you would turn in. Just making little notes in the margins to kind of keep yourself actively engaged with the text. And then of course, visualization, slowing down and really trying to make the pictures on the page appear in your mind almost like a movie will help a lot when it comes to understanding complex literature. Now, what we just did is much more microscopic than what I'm expecting you to do for summer reading. What we just did is much closer to the way we'll look at text in class next year. But I did want to model these different reader perspectives with the text and how they can be used to help you read more actively. So let's talk about this IB Learners Portfolio. This is part of the new IB standards that came out last year. Okay. So it's a place you'll hold your thinking, expand your understanding, and formally display your learning. And it becomes the source material for your IB assessment. So you'll do a lot of your assignments inside your learner's portfolio. You will need to share it with me. But you will also, it's a place for you to really just do some thinking and do some imagining. So the format for it is really up to you. It has to be digital. Because you don't want to lose it. You do have to keep it the entire 2 years. you will be using it to help you put together your IB assessments. If you like to draw, right, and you have the ability to draw digitally, OneNote is a good option because it works well with, like, if you have a surface and you want to draw, OneNote works really, really well with the surface. I've used Padlet a little bit. I just started using it, and in terms of a place where you can put a lot of different types of media and something that's really easy to use, it's entirely online. I really like Padlet for that. And then, you know, you can always just use a Google Doc, right? And you're going to share this with me in the Summer Reading Google Classroom by May 10th. It doesn't matter what format you use. It just needs to be something that you will have access to between now and when you graduate. And it has to be something that you can share with me. And it needs to be something that you can add to over time and also kind of take things from and manipulate it. So if you're not sure if your idea will work, the answer is probably just send me the link. And if I have any worries about it, I'll contact you. First section is going to be your summer reading. And you're going to let me know if you're going to do the Reader Who Reads or the Passive Reader assignments. And you can respond in multiple ways. You can just type up a response, right? Or you could do a video response. Or you could just record the audio and do an audio response. Any of those are fine. This is not about making you work or keep a log or prove that you read. This is about you expanding your abilities as a reader so that you are prepared for the reading demands that you're going to encounter next year. Each entry should be organized by date, title, author / platform, and pages read, if applicable. And this assignment will really only help you if you work on it over time. It can be started anytime, and it should be finished before school starts. But don't start it the week before school starts and try to finish it in the same week, because you'll basically be faking it. We know it. I know it. You know it. The goal here is not for you to give me something to grade. The goal here is for you to build your reading muscle, whether you are already a reader or you need to become a reader. If you imagine you want to become stronger as a weightlifter, I used to do CrossFit, so I like using weightlifting metaphors. And you walk into the gym every day and you look at the barbell and you don't pick it up, but you write down that you did, you know, 15 reps at 50 pounds. And then you walk out and you walk in the next day and you don't pick up the barbell. You just write down that you did this many reps at whatever weight. And you do that every day. You get no stronger whatsoever. And it doesn't matter what you've written down on that piece of paper because nothing has happened. But if you walk in the gym every day and you start at a weight that you can lift for a reasonable amount of reps, and you do that, and then the next day you come in and you do the same thing, but maybe just a little bit more, or a little bit better, or with a little bit more precise form, and you write it down, and then you come in and you do the same thing, and you track your progress over time. Not only do you get stronger, but you become aware that you can get stronger and that your progress has grown. And that gives you confidence for when things get really difficult later, which they will next year. Okay, so that is your summer reading assignment. If you have questions, you can always email me, or you can stop by one of my Zooms next week, and I will give the information to Mr. Cassidy and he can pass it along, or the other English teachers as well. And you can also always email me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I look forward to working with you going forward.